Yes, please. Hello, my name is Zofia Wojcicka, and I'm very happy and honored to welcome you at this subplenary session titled "To Whom Does the Museum Belong?" This is a session organized by the German Historical Institute, which was also one of the partners and co-organizers of the MSA conference. And at the same time, it's part of the so-called Le-Level Talks, a series of events held at the Institute. I will not tell you exactly who Le-Level was, but he was a quite great guy, actually a historian, a Polish historian from the 19th century, very open-minded and sort of free spirit. And I hope we will sort of keep up with his tradition. First, maybe some technicalities. The session will be held in English and German. So everybody who is on the webinar, on the Zoom, there is a translation provided. You have to go down on the bottom right side of the screen. You will see this globe for translation. And whenever you need a simultaneous translation, you have to choose the language channel, and you can also, if you want, switch off the original sound so it doesn't interfere. We are also streamed on YouTube and Facebook, but unfortunately, because of technical reasons, this translation is not provided on these channels. So there you will always hear only the floor language. You're invited very much to participate in the discussion by putting your questions into chat, Q for a question, a C for a comment, and then please put your questions in writing. And the same you can do also on Facebook and YouTube. You can also pose your questions, and our colleague Mateusz Mazzini will transfer them into chat so that we can see them. And now I would like to ask Professor Miloš Řezník, who is the director of the German Historical Institute, to open the official part of the session. Professor Řezník, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear participants. I cordially greet you from a car standing in the Lithuanian countryside on the way from Warsaw to Riga. In the post-pandemic age, we have at least the advantage among so many disadvantages that even under such conditions, it is possible to participate in conferences and discussions that take place far from where we are. It is a nice duty for me to start today's discussion at the 5th annual conference of the MSA and within the Le-Level colloquium series. Le-Level colloquia are a form of panel discussion established at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw more than 10 years ago. Their subject is usually historical topics of current discussions, disputes, new findings, or new interpretations. Usually twice a year, we invite 2, 3, or 4 historians, representatives of other disciplines or public life, and other actors to share and discuss their observations and opinions with us. As you can easily imagine, for a year and a half, we have not been able to organize such a colloquium in which we place great emphasis or immediacy. I am all the more pleased that Zofia Wojcicka, on behalf of our institute, has taken on the task of preparing such a colloquium online as part of the MSA conference, of which he is a co-organizer on behalf of the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. The topic of today's discussion fully corresponds to one of the thematic focuses of our research, in which we deal with the visualization and musealization of history, space, region, and identity. Zofia Wójcicka herself implements a project in this context, included in our research group called Functionality of History in the Postmodern Age. In the following 90 minutes, we will therefore address one of the many intersections of the thematic interests of the MSA and the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. I thank the organizers and participants of today's discussion and pass the microphone back to Zofia Wójcicka to take the presentation of the discussants and moderation. Thank you for your attention and have a nice afternoon in the virtual Warsaw. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reiching. I think it was the first sort of presentation or speech from a car we had during our conference, but it worked very well. So now let's enter into the discussion, and the topic, the problem, the question we would like to discuss here today is to whom does actually not the museum, but the museums actually belong? And at the first sight, it seems maybe a simple question. I had a exchange, a discussion or a short discussion with a colleague of mine, also co-organizer of the conference 2 days ago, and he said, well, I was looking at this, at your panel you're organizing, and I was wondering, like, what would you say, like, if you should answer, to whom do museums belong? And so I said, well, I don't know. So this is why I asked all those wise people to join the discussion, and maybe they have an answer. And he said, well, because actually I think the answer is quite simple. I think the answer is the museums belong to the stakeholders. So those who pay, may it be the state or the local governments or maybe some private owners, they are, so the museum belongs to them, they decide. And in a way, maybe he was right. But then I think it's not as simple as that. So first, what would this mean in praxis? How would museums ensure scientific and professional independence, autonomy from current politics? And how can they be autonomous on one hand, but also have democratic legitimacy on the other hand? And is that important to have democratic legitimacy? How important is scientific independence for museums to keep their authority? Yes, so that what they say is sort of believed and is trusted. And what is with other groups? So how to empower other memory agents, foremost the so-called source communities. So basically those people the museums tell about, may it be whatever, former Nazi concentration camp prisoners or prisoners of Stalinist camps, may it be descendants of former colonized societies, but also maybe the descendants of the colonizers of other groups. So what role do they or should they play in shaping not only museum exhibitions, but also their educational program and in general their programming? So you see, it's a quite complex question, and to discuss this, I asked four renowned and very experienced researchers, but also practitioners in this field. I would first maybe introduce. First, Anna Wetzimpoma. She is a historian and curator and also author, and she is also a director and founder of the Betsy Art Gallery. It's a gallery in Brussels, which is focused on exhibiting art also to diverse audience art by different also minority or marginalized groups in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnic origin, or also disabilities. And she is co-founder of the association New Artistic System in Brussels, which was created 2009, where she programmed the Afro-Brussels City Days with discussions on contemporary African art. But we invited her also, or foremost, because she was she was assigned as an expert by the so-called COMRAF, which was or is a committee composed of representatives of the African diasporas in Belgium to consult the refurbishment of the Royal Museum of Central Africa in Tervuren, which was reopened in December 2018. And at the moment, she is also an expert. She was appointed expert to draft the first report to guide the members of the House of Representatives of Belgium participating in the commission charged with analyzing Belgium's colonial past and its current consequences. Next speaker in our round is Dwandalene Rees. Welcome, Dwandalene. Dwandalene is Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs and Supervisory Museum Curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and in Washington, D.C., and she has over 30 years of experience in the museums field, including more than 10 years working at the Museum of African American History and Culture as a curator of music and performing arts. But before, she was also senior program officer at the National Endowment for Humanities and has worked previously as assistant director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum and chief curator at the Brooklyn Historical Society and curator at the Motown Museum in Detroit. So she has a very, very, very long museum experience. Günther Mosh is a historian and political scientist, currently professor at the Otto Suhr Institute of Political Science at the Free University of Berlin. He published on the history of the Weimar Republic and the NS dictatorship and on the German and European cultures of memory or remembrance. And since the 1990s, mid-1990s, until lately, until 2018, he has been the director of the Memorial and Museum Sachsenhausen. This is one of the first actually NS concentration camps on German territory. And at the same time, he was director of the Stiftung Brandenburgische Gedenkstätten, so the foundation memorial sites in Brandenburg. And in this position, he was engaged in actually all the debates of the 1990s and 2000s about this sort of positioning of the NS memorials and museums, vice versa, memorials commemorating the communist or Stalinist, the SED dictatorship, and also on debates on how to ensure museums and memorial sites independence from current politics, which were very vivid at that time in Germany. Last but not least, my dear colleague Piotr Maciej-Majewski, who is a historian and a professor at the University of Warsaw. His main scientific interests are the history of Czechoslovakia and the Czech clans and Czech-German relations in the 19th and 20th century. And he has recently published a fantastic book, which is not yet translated into other languages, but I hope will be soon translated, on the Munich Conference of 1938. And we invited him here for this discussion because in the years 2009, 2017, he was deputy director of the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk, responsible for development of the permanent exhibition. and he was dismissed from his post together with other team members after the what I would call the hostile takeover of the museum by the current law and justice government. I say hostile takeover because it was a takeover that was done in disregard of all legal principles and established practices in this field also in Poland. So now, as we are in Poland, maybe, or at least I am in Poland, and the conference takes online, but was organized by a Polish team. Maybe we would start from Poland, because here this question of kind of autonomy, scientific autonomy of museums became very well problematic in the, I think it was always, but especially in the last years. And so, dear Piotr, could you tell us from your perspectives, what is the situation in Poland? So what problems encounter historical museums in Poland when trying to ensure scientific independence? But I would put this question just sort of longue durée. So it's not only about the situation now, but how did it evolve, let's say, since the 90s? Piotr?
Thank you for your introduction, and first of all, thank you for invitation to this conference. I'm really honored to have a chance to speak in this panel. I would start perhaps with very general remark that the first and foremost problem which Polish museums and cultural institutions encounter today is a political pressure. It's exerted by the current national populistic government of the Law and Justice Party, and it endangers not only strictly historical museums, but also other institutions, for instance, art galleries. Recently, our Minister of Culture has dismissed the director of the famous Zachęta art gallery in Warsaw, and earlier it happened to the director of the National Museum in Warsaw and to other managers of culture. And the only guilt of those people was that they did not side with the ruling party, so with the current government. And historical museums are obviously in the worst position, as the Law and Justice Party tries to control and to monopolize so-called historical politics ever since this party was established. So even before it took power in Poland. And the hostile takeover of the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk in 2017, as you rightly call it, was only one among many other cases. Let me name shortly the most important ones. For instance, the Silesian Museum in Katowice was taken over because it seemed for some politicians too Silesian. So there was too much Silesianness in the Silesian Museum, let's say. Then Dariusz Stola, the director of the Museum of History of Polish Jews, Polin, so a quite important and renowned institution, was forced to resign because this museum spoke too openly about an anti-Semitism in Poland. Then funds for the European Solidarity Center in Gdańsk were substantially cut because some right-oriented historians and journalists did not like its exhibition. They criticized this exhibition in press. And last but not least, Polish radical right, which is an ally of today government, launched a huge defamation campaign against director of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum when he forbid bringing in anti-Semitic banners to the former Nazi extermination camp. And today, the government ordered active politician, former Prime Minister Szydło to enter this museum, the scientific council of this museum. What is also a violation of independence of this institution. And these direct violations of museums' scientific and organizational autonomy are combined usually with an attempt to establish new institutions which are devoted to the modern history. In 2005, Polish state ran only 8 such museums, including 3 military ones, some different museums of the Polish military, and 3 other commemorating former Nazi extermination camps. Today, it runs or co-runs 33 museums dealing with the history of the 20th century. To realize what does the government aim for, it's enough to read some of their names. So the names of those museums. For instance, the Museum of John Paul II and Primate Wyszyński in Warsaw. Then the John Paul II Museum, Remembrance and Identity in Toruń. Then 2 museums of so-called cursed soldiers, one in Warsaw, another in Ostrołęka. Then the Museum of Poles rescuing Jews during the Second World War in Markowa. This was the full name of this institution. It's not my explanation. So in a nutshell, in last 20 years, we can see an increasing subordination of historical museums to the government and growing political pressure to interpret modern history in a way which conforms to nationalistic, Catholic, and patriotic master narrative of the Polish right. I would end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piotr. I would have a question to you, but also to Professor Mosh. I think it's connected because rightly you're focusing on what happened during the last years in Poland since Law and Justice came to power. My question is the problem in Poland not even deeper? That, of course, you can say, well, authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, whatever we call it, government can break all the rules and take over all the museums, disregarding the rules. But is it not so that since 1989, 1990, no clear sort of rules, that it was never discussed what rules to introduce to kind of a secure scientific and professional independence of museums. So this is a question to you, and this is connected to a question to Professor Mosh, because to my understanding, there has been such a discussion in Germany in the correct me if I'm wrong, in the 90s and then the beginning of the 2000s, when Chancellor Kohl tried to implement a sort of very, well, offensive, I would say, politics of commemoration, not offensive in that sense it would offend anybody, but it was very, that he sort of decided himself on things, and that there was quite a big debate on what to do, how to ensure this autonomy of such sites. So my question would be to you, Professor Mosh, what do you think, how do you judge what would be the outcome of these struggles and discussions, and how would you see the situation in Germany today?
So shall I answer the first question, or Professor Mosh is first?
Short answer and then.
Well, I would say I agree and disagree with you, so because yes, there was no discussion about the relationship of Ministry of Culture and particular museums in Poland after 1990. I don't remember at least any such a discussion, but there was a huge debate on the underrepresentation of important historical topics in Poland. and it was then, let's say, crowned with the establishing of the Museum of Warsaw Uprising in Warsaw. And this museum set up a pattern to many other institutions. And I mean not only its obvious success, but also the way in which it speaks about Polish past. So the Poles were victims and heroes, and this was then followed by a series of other museums. And this is one point. Another point is that, of course, this let's say structural relationship between the minister or the ministry and directors of institutions and scientific councils of museums, because every bigger museum in Poland has its scientific council and also a special council which controls director and which gives him or her let's say clearance to run the museum. So it has worked very well. So until Law and Justice, until the second government of the Law and Justice, so until 2015, it has seemed that despite of different historical or political arguments, everything is okay. I mean that the functional core of this system is healthy. That after 2015, it has turned out that there are some weaknesses. For instance, that the directors of museums are not protected enough against the will of the ministry, and ministry can decide as it wish, because this is the minister who gives money and who nominates directors. So as we could see in the case of Pauline, he is able even to violate the law in order to postpone the nomination of a renowned scientist and very successful former director, because simply he doesn't like him. Yeah, and in this way he forced Mr. Stola to resign. Thank you.
Okay, I would bit disagree with you that everything was okay before.
This is how discussions look like.
But I will not get into it. I would ask maybe Professor Mosh to join the discussion and tell us how he sees this the situation in Germany. Professor Mosh, can you hear us? Professor Mosh? Hello? Professor Mosh, can you hear us? Professor Mosh?
We must unmute Professor Mosh's microphone.
You have to unmute yourself. Sorry, I was not even sure.
Ja, habe ich jetzt getan. Verstehen Sie mich jetzt?
Yes.
Verstehen Sie mich jetzt?
Yes. Okay.
Ich habe die Stummschaltung aufgerufen, ja? Verstehen Sie mich?
Just to remind you if you need the
Okay. Also zunächst einmal noch einmal ganz herzlichen Dank für die Einladung. Habe ich alles schon getan, muss ich wiederholen, offenbar.
We can hear you.
So, jetzt habe ich es nochmal getan.
We can hear
Wunderbar. Also noch einmal ganz herzlichen Dank für die Einladung, der ich gerne gefolgt bin. Ich muss mich aber gleich für die technische Qualität entschuldigen, denn durch einen ziemlich starken Sturm fiel das Wi-Fi aus und ich sitze jetzt, wie Sie vielleicht feststellen können, unter freiem Himmel, hinter mir der blaue Himmel, ansonsten einen immer noch starken Sturm und den Nachwirkungen. Also entschuldigen Sie bitte diese Technik. Aber direkt zu Ihrer Frage.
Maybe we'll wait just a few seconds, and if it doesn't, nothing changes, then we sort of continue the discussion and maybe wait till Professor Mosh is back on stage, so to say.
It has completely disappeared to me. Can you see him?
No. I guess we can't do much about that. He is just to Marisha, maybe you could write him that he should maybe try to join us once again. And we would continue, so I'm sorry for that. We would continue the discussion because I also have a more general question. You have to unmute yourself. Professor Mosh, you have to unmute yourself or
Die Verbindung ist offensichtlich schwierig. Verstehen Sie mich jetzt? Kann ich jetzt reden?
Ja, vielleicht können Sie Ihre Kamera, maybe you can switch off your camera, then you don't need so much internet and we can hear you.
Die ist an, aber gut, ich versuche es nochmal. Okay. So, also noch einmal nach meinem Dank und meiner Begründung, warum die Technik so schwierig ist, lasse mich zunächst einmal sagen, dass es in Deutschland ja darum gegangen ist, zwei Erinnerungskulturen zusammenzubringen. Und das ist das Entscheidende, dass es unterschiedliche Traditionen gab. Es gab in der DDR, ähnlich wie in Polen, die durch den Staat instrumentalisierte Erinnerungskultur, die sehr stark dominiert worden ist von der offiziellen Politik, wo die Gedenkstätten tatsächlich nachgeordnete Einrichtungen auch des Kulturministeriums gewesen sind und auch nur das vertreten durfte, was die offizielle Staatspolitik sagte. Dagegen hat es in Westdeutschland seit den Mitte der 80er Jahre etwa eine Entwicklung gegeben, die von unten gekommen ist. Die Erinnerungskultur ist erkämpft worden. Und zwar erkämpft worden durch viele Bürgerinitiativen gegen den Widerstand, häufig, ja größtenteils sogar, gegen den Widerstand der Politik. Und diese beiden Traditionen, die haben sich dann 1990 miteinander verbunden. Und wie dies geschehen sollte, darüber hat es dann eine sehr breite, sehr ausführliche, jahrelang dauernde Diskussion gegeben. Und zwar auf höchster Ebene. Der Bundestag hat eine Enquete-Kommission eingesetzt und oder zwei Enquete-Kommissionen sogar. Und diese Enquete-Kommissionen haben darüber beraten, wie die Erinnerungskultur zukünftig sein soll. Dabei hat man zum einen die eher auf den Bürgerinitiativen dezentral organisierte Erinnerungskultur beibehalten wollen und zum anderen einen Paradigmenwechsel insoweit machen wollen, als man aus den doch in Westdeutschland eher kleinen Einrichtungen große Einrichtungen machen sollte, die auch durch den Staat unterstützt worden sind. Das Ergebnis, ich will das abkürzen, ist eine von allen Parteien getragene Erinnerungskonzeption gewesen, eine Gedenkstättenkonzeption des Bundes, bei dem die Gedenkstätten auch an der Formulierung maßgeblich mitgewirkt haben. Und das Ergebnis kann tatsächlich von heute aus betrachtet doch als sehr positiv eingeschätzt werden. Wir haben einen Paradigmenwechsel insoweit gehabt, als wir zum einen aus den kleinen Gedenkstätten tatsächlich große Gedenkstätten gemacht haben, wie sie zum Beispiel in Polen auch schon vor 1989 existierten und auch in der DDR, aber nicht in der Bundesrepublik. Zum anderen aber haben wir sie auf eine neue Grundlage gestellt, wobei halt immer das Bewusstsein der Gefahr der Instrumentalisierung dieses doch sehr wichtigen historischen Themas gestanden hat. Im Ergebnis hat man Stiftungen gegründet, die selbstständig und unabhängig waren. Und die erste dieser Stiftungen ist 1993 die Stiftung Brandenburgische Gedenkstätten gewesen, die ich jahrelang, über viele Jahre, Sie erinnert, Sie haben es erwähnt, geleitet habe. Bei dieser Stiftung, selbstständige Stiftung öffentlichen Rechts, ist Folgendes wichtig gewesen. Zum einen wurde sie durch Gesetz gegründet. Das heißt, sie ist unmittelbar dem Parlament unterstellt und nicht einer Regierung, die natürlich beteiligt ist. Aber ganz wichtig ist, dass das Parlament der Urheber der Gedenkstättenstiftungen ist. Zum Zweiten hat man sich auf ein Modell geeinigt, bei dem nach dem Subsidiaritätsprinzip tatsächlich auf der inhaltlichen Ebene vor allen Dingen eine Fachkommission, also der wissenschaftliche Expertin, und auf der anderen Seite ein Gesellschaftsbeirat, bei dem die Opferverbände natürlich sehr stark vertreten sind, und ein sehr unabhängiger Direktor die inhaltliche Linie bestimmen. Darüber erhebt sich dann der Stiftungsrat, in dem natürlich die Geldgeber vertreten sind, wobei in Deutschland nicht allein immer die Bundesregierung, sondern zur Hälfte das Sitzland, die Landesregierung, und zur anderen Hälfte die Bundesregierung vertreten ist und dann aber nach dem Subsidiaritätsprinzip auch die beiden anderen Gremien Sitz und Stimme dort haben. Wir haben uns immer bemüht in dieser Zeit, und bislang ist das auch gelungen, wenn es auch immer wieder auch Konflikte gegeben hat. Wir haben uns immer bemüht, diese Teilung beizubehalten. Das heißt, die inhaltlichen Richtlinien wurden durch Experten und internationaler Beirat bestimmt in Zusammenarbeit mit den Gedenkstätten. Und die Rahmenbedingungen dagegen wurden tatsächlich durch den politisch dominierten, was normal ist, durch die Geldgeber dominierten Stiftungsrat festgelegt. Es gab immer wieder Konflikte dazwischen und Überschneidungen. Dabei kommt es, vielleicht überschätze ich das aus meiner eigenen Position heraus, dabei kommt es ganz wichtig auf den Direktor an. Er muss tatsächlich eine Unabhängigkeit haben. Unabhängigkeit bedeutet vor allen Dingen im Wissenschaftlichen unabhängig sein. Das heißt, er muss einen wissenschaftlichen Standpunkt haben, der auch allgemein anerkannt ist. Das ist ein wichtiges Element. Das Zweite ist, er sollte tunlichst einen Vertrag haben, der nach seiner Entfristung nicht willkürlich beendet werden kann. Das ist in deutschem Arbeitsrecht ist das verankert. Das heißt, wenn Sie sich keine großen Verfehlungen zu Schulden kommen lassen, ist es nicht möglich, einen solchen Vertrag aufzulösen. Das gibt eine gewisse Sicherheit. Nun will ich allerdings darauf verweisen, dass es auch in Deutschland natürlich inzwischen Entwicklungen gibt, die in eine Richtung gehen, die wir sehr genau beobachten müssen. Das eine ist, natürlich, die Zeitzeugen sterben leider. Und damit ist natürlich die gesellschaftliche Verankerung der Gedenkstätten sehr viel schwieriger zu implementieren, als dies vorhin gewesen ist. Wir haben durchaus Probleme, auch wenn es Nachfolgeverbände gibt, tatsächlich hier eine gesellschaftliche Repräsentanz so zu institutionalisieren, dass sie auch in Regierung, in Exekutive und Legislative gehört wird. Das ist ein Problem. Das zweite Problem ist, dass wir auch, wie andere Museen und andere Kultureinrichtungen auch, den Trend dazu haben, dass die Leitungen der jeweiligen Gedenkstätten befristet nur noch angestellt werden. Damit sind sie natürlich abhängig von dem Goodwill derjenigen, die die Einrichtungen bezahlen. Das mag in Museen noch dahin gehen. Aber in Gedenkstätten, die ja nun wirklich an einer ganz anderen Schnittstelle zwischen Öffentlichkeit, Politik und Kultur stehen, dort halte ich das für ein großes Problem. Und der dritte Punkt, der wir auch beachten müssen, ist die Internationalität. Für uns war es wichtig, dass wir die ausländischen Staaten, und der gab es bekanntermaßen sehr viele, weil halt zum Beispiel in Sachsenhausen allein 41 Nationen gewesen sind, dass wir die einigermaßen repräsentieren. Das ist sehr, sehr wichtig gewesen. Wir haben dies auch durch einen Gedenkstättenverbund, die sogenannte ICOM, also International Committee of Memorial Sites, haben wir versucht, diesem auch einen Rahmen zu geben. Nun, auch hier müssen wir feststellen, dass das Interesse leider des Auslandes an den deutschen Gedenkstätten deutlich nachgelassen hat. Das ist etwas, was wir feststellen müssen, was auch mit der Zeit zu tun hat, die dahin geht. Aber wir hören immer wieder, zum Beispiel von dem amerikanischen Außenminister unter Trump allerdings noch, da hören wir solche Sätze wie die Deutschen sollten sich endlich normalisieren und es aufgeben, immer wieder in die NS-Geschichte zu schauen. Es gibt dann natürlich damit auch einen Verlust eines internationalen Drucks auf die Erinnerungskultur in Deutschland. Also das sind aber Bedrohungen, wie sie in letzter Zeit eingetreten sind, wie sie sich entwickelt haben aus der Distanz der Zeit, was meines Erachtens ganz normal ist. Aber im Moment halten alle diejenigen Zusammenhänge noch, die wir in den 90er Jahren gestiftet haben. Durch eine großartig arbeitende Bundestags-Enquete-Kommission, durch eine Gedenkstättenkonzeption des Bundes, die von allen Parteien seit 1998 immer wieder prolongiert beschlossen wird und durch selbstbewusste Gedenkstätten, die sich international zusammengeschlossen haben. Also ich will denn doch an dieser Stelle eher positiv enden und sagen, dieses Modell, das wir in den 90er Jahren entwickelt haben, hat sich bisher bewährt, eingedenk trotzdem der Gefahren, denen wir ins Auge schauen müssen.
Thank you very much. Maybe just a technical advice in case you would have problems, Professor Mosh, later with that you could not connect. If you switch off your camera, then you don't need so much internet, and then maybe we can at least hear you. But for this time, it was fine. I would now like to introduce a sort of another group of potential museum stakeholders, which are memory agents in the museum sphere, which are what already also by Professor Mosh mentioned. Well, we could say source communities. So basically, those people the museums are talking about. In the case of the Sachsenhausen Memorial, those are on one hand the former Nazi, inmates of the NS camp, but also inmates of the Stalinist camp, which was established there directly after the war. In the case of the Royal African Museum in Museum of Central Africa in Tervuren, those are representatives of the members of the Congolese, not only Congolese, African diasporas in Belgium, but also people from the respective countries in Africa. In the case of the Museum of African American History and Culture, those are Afro-Americans in the United States, Afro-Americans. So my question would be to Betsy Mpoma and also to Gwendolyn Rice. First, Mpoma, you were, as already mentioned, a member of this expert group appointed by Comrab to consult the so-called Africa Museum when it was refurbished in the 2000 and reopened 2018. Could you tell us a bit more about first your experience working as an expert in this team, and also about the possible conflicts which occurred, and what was good, what was bad about this collaboration, what didn't function, and how could one improve things maybe? I heard some of your interviews, and I know you have also some critical reflections on that. And this is also connected to a question to actually you both, and also Professor Mosh. How important is the involvement of source communities, of those people the museums actually talk about in the museum building process? Anne,
okay. Hi everyone. Thank you, Sophia, for inviting me here. And the questions you're asking are very broad. I could take the whole day to answer it. But let me start from the very beginning. So this African museum here in Belgium has been built upon Congolese collections, as they call it, when Leopold II was the owner of the region of the Central Africa that is now named after the name of Congo. And this museum has been built and opened in 1909. And at the beginning of the 21st century, this building needed renovations. And that's why a work about how this museum would be renovated has started. And when it happened at the beginning of the 21st century, it was in 2003, the actual director of the African Museum decided that it would be interesting to be in touch with source communities. You're now frozen, so can everyone still hear me? Yeah, okay. Decided to enter a dialogue with source communities. So you know that in this museum, you have objects from the Congo, but also from Rwanda and Burundi, because Rwanda and Burundi have been annexed to, have been given to Belgium after the First World War as a reward of the implication of Belgium during the First World War, which is also something that Belgium has been able to achieve because of Congo, because of the uranium of the Congo, and also because of Congolese people who fought for Belgium into Africa when the First World War started, and also, yeah, let's stop it here for this topic. So, the process of being in dialogue with source communities, it was at the beginning like discussions into the COMRAF in between people working at the museums and representative of association, African association working in Belgium. And in 2014, after 10 years of discussions, the COMRAF decided that it would be necessary to be in touch with experts into museums, into art histories, into maybe also anthropology. And this is when the Groupe des Six, as they called us, has been appointed. So what can I say about this collaboration? This collaboration wasn't institutional. So we were not really hired by the museum. We were just experts that people working at the new collection in the museum could consult. But it was free consultation. If after one or two meetings, the expert of the museum decided that he didn't like what we had to say, or maybe what could they say, that our input wasn't realistic enough or something like that, or whatever, they could just stop. They could simply stop consulting us, and that was it. So yeah, I think at the very basis of the process of this collaboration, there was an issue. But what I think that is interesting also to mention is this question of underrepresentation of important historical topics into the collection of the museum, into the permanent exhibition. It's also something that we can see into the public space here in Belgium, because during the process of colonization, at the beginning of the 20th century, after Leopold II passed away. There has been a propaganda, and groups of people in Belgium really wanted to rebuild a nice image of the King Leopold II. So here in Belgium, everywhere in the public space, you have monuments that really tell another story about the colonization. They really present Leopold II as a king who built Belgium and who brought civilization to the Congo. And those images are not questioned by some scientists of the African Museum today. And you have a political current that is really recent, that is taking position towards those questions. And now we will see what will happen. But I think that also something that is important to mention is that the new position of the government might also be influenced by civil society that has been very active. Association or younger associations of people of African descent have been really active. And they have received a lot of visibility with the movement of the Black Lives Matter last year, but they were already active before, of course. And they also questioned the legitimacy of the African Museum at owning those collections. And also they have been questioning the legitimacy of the version of the colonial history that is present everywhere in the public space at the moment. So I hope, I answered at least a few of your questions.
I don't think we will be able to answer all the questions today, but it's just rather to open the discussion than to close it. So, Gwendoline, I actually the National Museum of African American History and Culture is from those museums who are discussing now the only museum I haven't seen, but I read a bit about this, and from what I understand, the situation there in Washington was a bit different, so that representatives of the African American community were from the very beginning on sort of involved in the museum creation process. They were among the initiators, and they were sort of also what Betsy Mpoma mentioned, they were structurally involved in this process of building the museum. So could you tell us a bit more about this experience? So how did it work in this project, and what problems maybe emerge still, and were there any conflicts in relation with the African American communities sort of outside the museum, or the African American communities and the museum stakeholders on the other hand? And I would also keep up this question: how would you say, how important is it in general to involve source communities in the museum building process? And maybe I would ask a bit provocative now, sort of to be the devil's advocate. If you say a museum is a scientific in a way institution, and it has to be sort of scientific. So if we just hire the best scientists or researchers in this field who make an objective history, why would we care if those are representatives of the source communities or not? Let's say it's a provocative question, but what would be your answer?
Sure, I definitely have opinions about this. It's important to start with, particularly with our museum at the Smithsonian, that the Museum of African American History and Culture is really built on the shoulders of traditions of ethnically or culturally specific museums that really started in the late 60s. These were all community-based and serving their communities because the larger institutions weren't telling their stories. So you have African American museums, you've got the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle, Japanese National American. So all of these, the philosophies of these institutions were to tell more inclusive stories, but make sure those stories that weren't told in the larger institutions that have a longer history. So in one sense, our museum was not inventing a model. It was building on a model that had sustained these institutions up to this point when a museum was approved to be built by the federal government. My career has really been based on working with source communities, as you call it. I call it community-based work, in that it really is an inclusive history. I try to blur the line between the academic and the community, because expertise resides in all kinds of places. You have scholars or curators who study a culture or a topic, but then you also have people who live those experiences. And while a scholar or a humanist has certain kind of skills, the communities, have the true authentic voices. So I think it's difficult for institutions and come and tell stories of cultures and peoples and communities without their voices. So that's always been critical to the work I do. That was very important in the museum from the get-go. It was a community endeavor to fight to get the museum built. That was over 100 years trying to get to that point when it was signed into legislation. And from the beginning, museum director Lonnie Bunch, he really understood that working with communities and hearing their voices and finding out not only the history, because these communities have been keeping the history. As large institutions, we can't swoop in and take over and say we know everything. That's not true. I think all the work that we're talking about telling stories that have been marginalized or erased, and that we're trying to complete the picture. And so there were numerous conversations across the country about what the museum should be, what stories it wanted to tell, what people wanted to understand. And those expectations and those desires were part of the foundation that really outlined the exhibits that would be in the gallery, as well as the programming and the work we did outside the community, even before the museum was built. Part of our effort is not only to tell the story as a museum, but to empower these communities to tell their own stories. So we did a lot of technical support, so to speak. We would do programs and go out in the communities and help communities, advise them on their own objects, teach them how to conserve their objects. So it was really a joint venture. It wasn't us, it wasn't them. We were doing this together. And to me, that everybody's invested in the story, so everyone has a stake. Now, that does not mean that there aren't tensions. I've had the privilege of working on a local, state, regional level, and at a national level. And the issues are very different about autonomy. So much of autonomy in the museums in the States, our museums and our institutions have independence. I think sometimes when things get tricky, if a topic or a theme catches someone's imagination, I think the tension is, and after years of careers in working in the museum sector, becomes funding and support. I don't think we have the level of intervention that's been described to some levels, but there are watchful eyes. You never know if the subject matter is going to catch someone's attention, and then how they're going to react. It has a lot to do with what's going on in society over the last year and a half, particularly with COVID-19 and the referendum on racial politics and racism in the world over. Our communities are really calling out our institutions, those who have not been as inclusive and representative of those stories. A lot of those are art museums. I will say, I think history museums in the United States are, a good majority of them are ahead of the curve. I think it's starting as early, maybe in the mid to late 80s. I know when I worked at the Brooklyn Historical Society in the 90s, we were doing really progressive work. We did exhibits on AIDS in Brooklyn. We did exhibits on the Chinese community, the Latino community. We worked with the Crown Heights community, looking at the Caribbean Americans, the Hasidic Jews, and the tensions there. So I was really trained in that kind of work. And the tension is, as experts, practitioners, and professionals, we have a certain responsibility to our institutions and a way of doing things. And then our community members have their own opinions. And sometimes working together is great to a certain point, but then as a professional, there's certain things, for instance, like conservation. There are things that you would do to an object or wouldn't do to an object that a community member would see, why not? So many times when people donate things, they want to be able to take them out on their own, or they want to be able to touch them. And as a museum professional, you wouldn't do that. So how do you meet the community? How do you be co-authors, really true co-authors, shared authority in developing these projects? And I think that's the big test case, where as institutions, what is our responsibility? Are we stewards of the collection? It's our responsibility to give the complete picture? Is our responsibility to the community? And if it is, how much authority do we share, and do we really do it? I think that is an issue that bears further exploration. You know, in a future time, I'd really like to experiment with that, where the institution does not have all the power, but how does that change museum practice overall? When you really, I think, you know, you were talking about consultants who weren't paid, and with the minute that they heard something they didn't like, we don't want to work with you anymore. So what if we switch that? You know, we had paid consultants, we respect the expertise of these community members, and if they say something we don't like, then it's incumbent upon us as professionals to maybe change our own paradigm about how we do our work and how we create these institutions for the 21st century. Because when push comes to shove, our museums are colonialist enterprises. They were built to celebrate a certain kind of narrative, and that's changing over the time. And what do we want our modern institutions really to reflect? And you know, we are all seeing that there are cultural wars at play there, and who gets to control the narrative, because we're saying that museums play a critical role in making sure that certain stories are told and that our history is remembered. And I think that is going to be an ongoing tension that we need to work out, and how we ensure that our museums have, as they have evolved over time, really reflect the interests, concerns, and stories of the people.
Thanks a lot. That was very interesting, and that links into my next question, I think, to you all, but mostly to you and Betsy Pommer, and also to Professor Mosh. I was living for some time in Jena and in Weimar, and I could learned a lot about the conflicts there. There is also a memorial museum to a former, on a place of a former NS camp, but there was also a Stalinist camp after the war. And in the 90s, when the museum was refurbished after after the breakdown of communism, there were quite some tensions between representatives of the former NS camp inmates and the former Stalinist camp inmates, part of whom a part of them were in some way or the other implicated in National Socialism, and this was one of the reasons they ended up in this horrible camp. And I guess the situation was probably not very different at Sachsenhausen. So my question to you, Professor Mosh, but also to you, Vanin Reis, and to you, Betsy Pommer, you raised it already. How to deal with such conflict? Like, you have different, whatever, source communities or communities which kind of would like to have a say in these museums, but who is sort of eligible to take part in this discussion? How to deal and manage the conflicts between those different groups? Could you share your experiences on that, Professor Mosh? I guess Professor Mosh is still listening to the translation.
Gerne, gerne. Hören Sie mich? Hören Sie mich oder muss ich wieder was ändern?
No, we can hear you.
Hören Sie mich?
Ja, wir hören Sie.
Okay, gut. Ja, Sie haben tatsächlich eines der Hauptprobleme angesprochen. Das ist die sogenannte zweifache Geschichte bestimmter Konzentrationslager. Buchenwald ist das eine, aber das größte war Sachsenhausen, aber es gibt auch noch andere. Eigentlich haben alle Lager, auch Neuengamme im Westen und wo auch immer, auch Auschwitz übrigens und Theresienstadt, haben eine mehrfache Geschichte. 1945 hat man häufig diese Orte weiter genutzt, und zwar durchaus auch zum Zwecke der Internierung. Also fast alle Konzentrationslager, ob Dachau, ob Neuengamme, ob Sachsenhausen und Buchenwald, wurden als Lager benutzt, indem man tatsächlich wieder Menschen eingesperrt hat. Das hatte rein logistische Gründe, denn man hat natürlich nach dem Ende des Zweiten Weltkriegs solche Orte gesucht, wo man die Menschen zusammenfassen konnte, und da boten sich solche Orte an. Das ist also zunächst einmal nicht unbedingt ein Problem, das sich aus der politischen Situation ergibt, sondern es ist ein logistisches Problem gewesen. Für den Bereich der SPZ und der späteren DDR gilt allerdings, dass in diesen Internierungslagern, wie sie durch die Alliierten insgesamt konsensual beschlossen worden sind, durch alle vier Alliierten und im Potsdamer Abkommen 1945 noch einmal bestätigt wurden, dass dort eben nicht nur diejenigen eingesessen sind, die nach diesen Kriterien als Nationalsozialisten galten, sondern eben zunehmend auch Menschen, die sich mit den neuen politischen Bedingungen der Diktatur nicht abfinden wollten. Das hat verschiedene Gründe, die man jetzt nicht alle aufzählen kann, aber ich will damit deutlich machen, die Geschichte dieser sowjetischen Speziallager ist sehr kompliziert und hat verschiedene Aspekte. Und es ist natürlich bei der Neukonstitution der Gedenkstätten nach 1989, 90 ein wichtiges Anliegen gewesen, auch die bis dahin in der DDR völlig verschwiegene Geschichte dieser Menschen darstellen zu können. Denn sie haben sehr gelitten. Es sind relativ hohe Todeszahlen. Also von Sachsenhausen wissen wir, dass bei 60.000 Inhaftierten 12.000 an Hunger und Krankheiten verstorben sind. Das ist also eine relativ hohe Todeszahl. Und die anderen Menschen haben ebenfalls auch in diesen Lagern unter den unglaublichsten Bedingungen sehr gelitten. Das heißt, sie brauchten natürlich eine Stimme. Sie mussten ihr Leid darstellen. Das war nicht nur legitim, das war für uns eine Pflicht, dies zum Ausdruck zu bringen. Insoweit hat man am Anfang gleich auch in der Konzeption der Gedenkstättenstiftung, der Stiftung Braun mit Gedenkstätten, diese Opfergruppen repräsentiert und ihnen eine Stimme gegeben. Das ist allerdings, da haben Sie recht, nicht nur in Buchenwald, sondern in Sachsenhausen außerordentlich konfliktreich gewesen. Die beiden Opfergruppen, wenn ich sie einfach mal zusammenfassen soll, KZ-Opfer auf der einen Seite, Speziallageropfer auf der anderen Seite, sie haben sich nicht nur nicht verstanden, sondern sie haben sich teilweise auch befehdet, zweifellos. Wir haben trotzdem die Meinung vertreten, dass alle diese Opfergruppen gemeinsam in einem Beirat, in einem gesellschaftlichen Beirat vertreten sein sollen. Das war nicht einfach und trotzdem war es uns ein Anliegen, ihre Stimme zum Ausdruck zu bringen, auch wenn es häufig zu Konflikten geführt hat. In dieser Situation hat dann doch die Wissenschaft eine wichtige Vermittlerposition eingenommen. Denn Sie müssen wissen, die Geschichte der sowjetischen Speziallager ist nicht nur nicht erforscht gewesen, sondern sie wurde von beiden deutschen Staaten instrumentalisiert im Rahmen des Kalten Krieges. Auf der einen Seite war Adenauer es gewesen, der alle die Häftlinge des sowjetischen Speziallagers als Opfer kommunistischer Diktatur betrachtet haben, was zweifellos nicht richtig ist. Denn die ganz große Mehrheit dieser Menschen, die in Speziallager eingesessen haben, sind nach den Kriterien des Potsdamer Abkommens inhaftiert gewesen. Trotzdem hat man aus dieser kleinen Minderheit, die es gegeben hat, zweifellos, der politisch Verfolgten, der stalinistisch Verfolgten, eine Mehrheit gemacht. Im Sinne einer Auseinandersetzung des Kalten Krieges. Umgekehrt hat die DDR jegliche, nicht nur das Lager komplett verschwiegen und tabuisiert, sondern wenn es überhaupt thematisiert worden ist, dann hat man immer nur gesagt, das seien Nationalsozialisten Verbrecher gewesen. Aus dieser Situation kam man nur heraus, indem wir konsequent von Anfang an auf Wissenschaft und Forschung gesetzt haben. Wir haben ein großes Forschungsprojekt implementiert mit den Universitäten Jena, Hagen, mit den Gedenkstätten Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen und vor allen Dingen auch dem russischen Staatsarchiv, das ganz wichtig gewesen ist, und haben ein großes Forschungsprojekt initiiert. Im Rahmen dieser Forschung, die bis heute noch nicht ganz abgeschlossen sind, zweifelsohne gibt es noch viel Forschungsbedarf, konnten wir jedenfalls zahlreiche dieser Mythen entkräften. Zum Beispiel der Mythos, der von einem Teil der Opferverbände der stalinistisch Verfolgten immer wieder betont worden ist, es hätte eine Vernichtungsabsicht gegeben. So hat man eine unpassende Vergleich gezogen. Man sagte, die Nationalsozialisten haben die Menschen mit Zyklon B ermordet. Die Stalinisten haben sie mit Wassersuppe ermordet. Wir konnten allerdings durch sorgfältige Forschung, und dabei war es wichtig, dass wir von den russischen Kollegen in den Archiven unterstützt wurden, nachweisen, dass es diese Vernichtungsabsicht nicht gegeben hat. Gleichzeitig konnten wir die bei weitem übertriebenen Opferzahlen reduzieren, und zwar auf die tatsächlichen Zahlen, die hoch genug sind, die aber nicht den Charakter tragen, der von den stalinistischen Opferverbänden gerne intendiert worden ist, nämlich sie seien Vernichtungslager gewesen. Also dieser Prozess der Kommunikation, der sehr schwierig gewesen ist und der immer wieder zu Konflikten geführt hat, haben wir versucht weiterzuführen. Dabei war wichtig, dass, was ich vorhin das Subsidiaritätsprinzip nannte, dass der Beirat immer nur eine Stimme hatte. Das heißt, wenn man etwas erreichen wollte, wirklich, dann musste man sich auf Kompromisse einlassen. Konfrontationen führten nicht tatsächlich zu Ergebnissen.
Professor Mosh, if you could switch off your camera, then we would maybe hear you, because now you are frozen. Shall we wait a second? And if not, we would. Okay, I hope Professor Mosh will join us in a minute, but I think we have already heard a lot about those conflicts. And my question, I would sort of bounce back the question to the three of you. So to Betsy Pomma, to Gwendolyn Rice, and to Piotr Majewski. Professor Mosh, you are there. Could we continue maybe with the next question, because it links to your question, from different positions, as a representative of the communities, as a museum practitioner, you are also working with all those different groups. May it be former war veterans in Poland, or concentration camp survivors or victims, may it be communities or NGOs of African Americans, or of the African diasporas. What is your view on this? How can museums manage this conflicts, and who is eligible to take part in the discussion from this group? Who is the representative? How to mediate between those different groups is really this, what Professor Moore stressed, that the museum sort of took a stand. We are the scientists, and finally we can handle out the sort of differences, conflicts. Is this a way? What are your experiences? Who would like to say something? Gwendolyn, let's see.
Sure. I think one of the things in nature that has changed over time for museums, particularly when you're dealing with conflict, is not, authorities of history, but seeing our institutions as facilitators, as a space where diverse points of view can be addressed, discussed. Everything we talk about what we do is about conversations. It is, there is not one perspective that overrides everything. And so I think a lot of our institutions have, morphed into seeing ourselves as civic institutions, and that part of that civic dialogue comes through our exhibits and our programming and in our work with communities. I think speaking for our museum, one of the challenges is thinking, we're a museum of African American history and culture, but getting our audiences to know and understand that there's not one African American experience, there are multiple. And even as an institution, we're African American, we also deal with the diaspora because we're part of that diaspora. And how, as an institution, do you reflect all those diverse points of view, those diverse experiences? And that is a challenge. They come by ethnicity, class, gender, region. They're just multitudes, and it's hard to address every single thing in all of your museum galleries. So that is definitely a challenge, because when you present one story, there's always another story that challenges that particular narrative. And in some sense, the challenge is trying to be all things to all people, which is impossible. But I think your intentionality and how you position yourself as an institution is really critical, and how your visitors react to you. There is I think with our museum, there's a level of trust that is really important to our institution. you know, that sets us apart in many ways, just from the history of the institution to how it was built. That gravitas, that trust that the community has in the institution, that tells stories in a way that really reflect their true experiences. We also talk very frequently about the unvarnished truth. And I would say, as an institution, we don't shy away from those challenging conversations, whether in the exhibitions we produce. You know, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to visit our institution, but the stories in African American history are not easy. They're challenging. As you see in this current climate, some people may not agree with the way we tell these stories or what we emphasize in telling those stories, but we don't shy away from it. I would say that we invite a dialogue. I think that's the only honest and true way to really wrestle with these histories. And I think coming out of the humanities, it's really important, as Professor Munch said, to have those different perspectives, to bring people to the table. They don't have to agree, but I think as our responsibilities as institutions and my responsibility as a federal employee, as a representative of serving the public good, is that we have to create spaces where people can engage in dialogue and wrestle with the good and the bad and diverse opinions. And that's really the only way we get to a real civil society in which we could work together and have a narrative that really includes all of us.
Piotr and Anna, what would you have from your experience, Anna, from your experience as a representative of the communities? What do you think? How to manage those? Did you encounter, like, did you have different positions within the people engaged from the African diasporas in refurbishing the museums? Like,
yeah, first, I'm not sure I can be, or I want to take the responsibility to be like the representative of the African diaspora. You know, I was born in Belgium from Congolese parents who came here to study, and I want to speak in my name as an, you know, as an Afro-Belgian woman. And of course, I know that my point of view also represents the point of view of others here, but first of all, I don't want to say that we as a diaspora people speak into one name, like we have one position, one point of view. What is sure is that, I mean, there are different museums. You have the art museums and you also have the history museums. Now, we are talking more about the history museum with the African Museum in Tervuren. But in general, what we want, I cannot speak in general because art museums and history museums are so different. But what I think would be important here in Belgium would be to have a place where African communities could gather and could also feel that they are in charge of the narrative. So what I always say is that we're talking about, you know, the support, the funding. We need to, the government here needs to find a solution to really fund initiatives of people of the diaspora who have projects. You have people here who have projects, and those projects and those narratives need to be heard, because what happens is that you have people from the civil society who raise their voice, and they do it with the means that they have. And most of the time, it's non-conventional means. For example, you have this person, this man, who went to the Quai Branly in Paris, and he even came here in Brussels and in the Netherlands, claiming his own heritage and saying that he was taking the objects away from the museum to bring them home. He went, and of course, the museum called the police and stuff like that. But then afterwards, when the museums want to enter into dialogue with how they call, with what they call source communities, they don't go and try to discuss with the people who really raised the questions, who make those questions visible to the public, to the large public. They tend to search for and to find people who they call more reasonable to talk with. I think it's already the first error, because it's not because someone made a public speech full of emotion, I would say, that this person is not capable of having a reasonable or rational discussion with you afterwards. So if I can say something about dialoguing, it's really about the museum needs to stop choosing the people they think are legitimate to speak with, and really enter into dialogue with real activists, like people really fighting or really engaging themselves in changing the situation, in claiming a narrative. And the question of funding will really come across all the time, because that's also, how can you create dialogue when people don't speak from the on the same level? It's not possible. So I think it's really something, a question that is critical. But in Belgium, we need to, and elsewhere too, we need to have more initiatives coming from the people of the diaspora themselves, and those initiatives need to receive the sufficient fundings, and also that will enable the people to have to tell their other stories, and not being focused all the time on what's happening into those history museums.
Great, thank you. I have lots of more questions, but maybe at this point we should take up some of the questions from the audience. And one of the questions would go to Annabeth Simpoma and Dwandlin Rees, and this is a question, maybe I'll just read out loud, you can also see it in the chat. From the Polish perspective, we have heard about the influence of or change in politics and memory institutions. What would you be comfortable sharing something about this from your very interesting perspective? So I guess it's a question about the relation between politics and museums in Belgium and in the United States, in particular in regard to the Museum in Tervuren and the Museum of African American History. Dwandlin already mentioned a bit this issue, but maybe you could elaborate on that a bit more.
I can give one example that's really in the context of this last year. You know, as I said, sometimes certain projects or something catches somebody's eye. And in the States right now, the big discussion is about critical race theory. And all of a sudden, you know, this is something in the academy about looking at systemic effects of racism, but it is now a buzzword throughout the country. So it's not just in academic societies, but, you know, schools are talking about it, politicians are talking about it. And so in the country, there is this what's always been there, but this interest of leading with race and discussing the history of the United States. We have a portal on our website called Talking About Race. And so it's just another example about some of the things that have risen to the level of public attention and now is a frequent topic of conversation. And so you have things, there's a lot of independence at our museums at the Smithsonian, but there are moments where for one reason or another, they catch the attention of the larger public and then really become a point of discussion and heightened awareness of the work that we're doing. And all I can say is, as an institution, we remain politically aware, but we're also committed to the work, the important work that we need to do. And for the sake of just being careful, I would just say that there is that level of awareness, but it also points to how important the work that we're doing, because people are aware of it and some people are uncomfortable with it. But we see that as a way of really encouraging our visitors to address those things that make them uncomfortable. Because I think, speaking for myself, that's a way to initiate a dialogue and also shows you that you're doing something that really raises to the level of public attention. So there's always, you really just have to be mindful in the circles you operate and be proactive in anticipating certain responses and being able to frame them in the larger context of humanistic inquiry, the work that the museum is trying to do, and really be able to explain that. I think to doing this work and knowing the climate and the potential challenges that might be to it, that an institution just needs to be prepared and have solid arguments to really support why you're doing what you're doing and why it's a solid work, while it's a true humanities experience and that it fits into your overall mission. So that awareness in the various clientele that you serve and various constituencies is very important in doing this work, so that you can run offense instead of defense in many ways in getting your message across.
And Anne Betsy, I guess I can only imagine that the Africa Museum in Tervuren, this was a highly political sort of enterprise, the refurbishment. Could you say something from your perspective as a sort of insider, outsider?
Yeah. When talking about, for example, let's take the question of restitution, because it's the hot topic at the moment. When those questions about the restitutions of the looted artifacts have been raised here, the answers that we would receive from the director of the museum was always the same. It was, yeah, it has to be a political decision. A political decision needs to be taken in order to enable us to act. And now we see that into the political world, there has been changes. Last year, after the gathering about the Black Lives Matter, the king in Belgium presented his excuses. At least he said he was sorry about colonization and the effects of colonization for Congolese population. And he also admitted that there was a continuity in between colonialism and today everyday racism. So that was really like a very landmark step, because before that, the answers that we would receive as Black communities here trying to change the situation, it was that racism didn't exist. So, and now 1 year later, you have this commission, federal commission, with the group of experts that have been working on writing a report, and I have been included in this group of experts, which is also something absolutely phenomenal, because I don't come from the academic world. I have a master's degree into art history, and I work as an art historian and curator, but you know, I don't work for a university. And I really come also from the more activist world. So even if in the group of experts, you didn't have a lot of people with my background, like I was the only one with this background, if you put it into the larger context, you can see that it's something that is really important. So, and now, so 1 year later, you have the minister of, because I'm thinking in French, sorry, but the minister in charge of this Museum of Tervuren, who really said, okay, now we need to change the situation. We need to see and to really organize researches about the provenance of the artifacts that are being shown at the Africa Museum in order to talk about restitution. So it's another huge step that has been made. And even people working at the Africa Museum, Africa Museum here is an institution, but into these institutions, you have people working there. You have some people who are totally agree, who agree with the position of the minister, but you also have people who don't agree with this position and who have a lot of power into the museum. So I think that now that we have a real political stance and position, we can work from this towards the future. And at the same time, I think that the political position that is at stake now is very, very wise, and maybe it's good, but because talking about the provenance of the objects also erases the fact that it's almost impossible to speak about equal relationships in between people from the Congo at the end of the 19th century and Belgian people. How would it be possible to justify that you only have people, objects coming from Africa into European museum and not the contrary at all, at any moment? You know, how would the people who would do those researches be able to really justify that at some point people have been talking from equal to equal, and that not all the artifacts have to be discussed, that the presence of not all the artifacts has to be discussed here into the museums? But maybe I'm going too far for now. But in my opinion, it's a question that would also need to be addressed. But if we go from step to step, I think the position that is being taken now on a political level is a very necessary position into the context.
Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot. Maybe I would address one or two more questions from the audience, and then I think we have to wrap up slowly. One question would go to Piotr Majewski, and this is a question, thank you for the presentation. I wonder what is the role of academics in the collisions around the museums? You had described what professional communities are involved and how, and is the situation in Warsaw maybe different, for example, than the situation in Gdańsk? And maybe I would just add to this another question, which would probably go mostly to both you and also Professor Mosh. I wonder if, okay, it's a more general, again, about the relation of to you all about politics and museums. Surely if a museum is funded by a state, at least in part, the state will interfere in it's inclined to interfere. The British government has placed George Osborne, a former government minister, as head of the trustees of the British Museum. What would you suggest in the way round this? So it's also about personal issues and who is entitled to make whom to the chief museum person in a country. Piotr?
So I would start with the first question, and yes, thank you for it. It's quite important, and as you perhaps know, the academic community in Poland is splitted or divided the same as the whole society. So there are historians who side with today government, and they strongly defend its and promote its historical politics, and of course in all such debates they took part, and they served to the government as experts, and their expertise was usually used in order to justify steps taken by the government or by the Minister of Culture vis-a-vis particular institutions. It happened in Gdańsk. We were, since the very beginning of our mission, we were attacked by some historians and right-oriented journalists. They usually came, shoulder with shoulder together, and then they were rewarded by the government with the seats in the scientific council once the museum has been retaken by the today government. So I would say that some of those people, sorry for being frank, but I would say that there are sometimes they are useful idiots, as Lenin put it, of useful idiots of the government. Sometimes they are really of the very conservative and this traditional perspective. Some of them even criticize the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk because of its pacifistic, let's say, message to the audience. They said that it's not true that the war is an evil. According to them, war has its also very positive aspects. It makes man stronger and more patriotic. So it's very difficult to argue with such the perspective, because it is so far from our point of view and so far from the whole concept of the museum that accepting it would have meant the total destruction of the exhibition. And this fortunately did not happen. So the changes which were introduced forcibly by the new director under the aegis of today Minister of Culture went not so far. So they slightly changed the exhibition, and especially they changed, let's say, the epilogue of this exhibition in this less pacifistic meaning. But the whole exhibition wasn't demolished as it was proposed in the very beginning. And I just speaking, I would like to add something which is connected with Professor Mosh's statement. I would say that, you know, from the perspective of legal measures, the independence of the museum in Gdańsk was quite well protected. So we had an international scientific council, which you described as one of the important, let's say, facilities. Then we have trustee board, what made us independent from the current good or bad will of the minister. And then our director, my boss, Paweł Machcewicz, had a manager contract for 9 years. But as you perhaps know, all of these were not enough to protect museum, because the government invented a legal trick saying that it is going to merge our museum with another one, which in the matter of fact didn't exist, or it existed only on the paper. And then when they merged both institutions, they were allowed to remove director, to just to dissolve trustee board, International Scientific Council, and to hire their own historians and museologists, who then, let's say, agreed with everything what was proposed by the new director. Thank you. Yes, I forgot to answer your question, but can you repeat it, Zosia?
Yes, maybe I'll summarize. I think it's a question about relation between museums and politics, and about personal politics. So personal policy. So what you do if a government just puts something ahead of a big institution taking care of the museum, who is just a politician but maybe not an expert, and just to reward him for something, or just to have the political line, in short.
I would say, first of all, that I don't think that the parliament is the most appropriate place for discussion on the content of museums. Sometimes it's said so, but I think that, at least in Poland, the majority of our MPs, among whom there are surprisingly many historians or history teachers, so they usually represent very simplistic vision of museum as such, and of history as such. And what they demand is the promotion of a heroic, ultra-patriotic, and sometimes even very nationalistic vision of history. So it may sound anti-democratic, but I think that the parliamentary control over museums must not be exerted by this direct, subordination, and must be led through the appropriate organs. I mean, the Ministry of Culture, of course, but the minister or trustee boards. But those institutions must, of course, respect existing law, not only the particular rules, but also the rules which exist in the civic society. So the Ministry of Culture and politicians should respect national social plurality of culture, and it's, in my opinion, it's a very bad way of solving those problems when one political party tries to introduce its own master narrative and to neglect others. I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope so.
Okay, thank you very much. There are other questions in the chat, and actually you opened a new field which I didn't even dare to open, which is this question of the kind of democratic legitimacy of museums. But unfortunately, the sort of framework of our conference is very strict and it doesn't allow us to go over time. So maybe to wrap up, I would have a sort of last question round and ask you to reply very, very briefly. I know we didn't answer the question yet, but if you would say in 3 sentences, to whom does the museum belong? What would you say? Professor Mosh, would you start? You have to unmute yourself. Hello, you have to unmute yourself. Professor Mosh, we don't hear you.
Okay, jetzt müsste es funktionieren.
Yeah, yeah.
Immer noch nicht?
Yeah, now it's okay.
Ich habe alles wieder ein- und ausgeschaltet. Funktioniert es jetzt?
Ja.
Okay, gut. Also zum einen, wenn man 3 Sätze sagen soll, zum einen ist natürlich das Museum und die Gedenkstätten sind Spiegel der Gesellschaft. Das ist schon immer so gewesen. Also insoweit höre ich und kenne die Situation natürlich anderswo schon sehr gut und auch bei uns. Aber man muss deutlich sagen, sie haben sich natürlich diese Einrichtungen seit dem 19. Jahrhundert, seitdem sie sich entwickelt haben, immer wieder stark verändert und haben die gesellschaftliche Entwicklung wiedergespiegelt. Also mit Verlaub gesagt, insoweit ist dies ein natürlicher Prozess, dass sich auch die Entwicklung in der Gesellschaft in diesen Museen widerspiegelt. Das ist das eine. Das zweite ist, ich glaube, ganz wichtig sind, obwohl ich ja nach dem letzten Beitrag des Kollegen etwas unsicher bin, sind tatsächlich Strukturen. Und diese Strukturen müssen in der demokratischen Gesellschaft so verfasst sind, dass sie einen pluralistischen Diskurs sichern. Das heißt natürlich auch, dass wenn sich rechte, ich sage das jetzt mal direkt, rechte Mehrheiten ergeben, die konservative, gar nationalistische oder sogar rassistische Theorien vertreten, dann werden die sich auch in diesen Einrichtungen widerspiegeln. Entscheidend ist aber, dass die Strukturen von Anfang an so gefestigt sind, dass der Diskurs, der dort stattfindet, auch immer den Minoritäten und den anderen Ansichten eine Stimme verleiht. Also das ist, glaube ich, das Entscheidende. Wir müssen dafür sorgen, dass der plurale Diskurs garantiert ist. Das zweite oder das dritte ist danach, worüber wir leider zu wenig gesprochen haben, weil es ja eigentlich der Anlass unserer Konferenz ist, die Internationalität. Ich glaube tatsächlich, dass wir uns Standards geben müssen im internationalen Bereich. Also ich darf sagen, dass wir im International Committee of Memorial Sites haben wir eine Ethikcharta beschlossen. Diese Ethikcharta besteht aus 10 Punkten und legt fest, was eine Gedenkstätte, was die Standards, die ethischen Standards einer Gedenkstätte sind. Und diese müssen dann auch international einklagbar sein. Ich darf sagen, dass dies in Deutschland in einem Konfliktfall sehr erfolgreich gewesen ist. Es gab damals von der Fraktionsvorsitzenden der CDU, der heutigen Bundeskanzlerin, im Bundestag einen Antrag, der darauf hinausgelaufen wäre, sowjetische Speziallager und Konzentrationslager gleichzustellen. Wir haben dieses abwehren können mit Hilfe tatsächlich einer internationalen Gemeinschaft der Gedenkstätten. Insoweit würde ich auch dem Museumsbund, dem Internationalen Museumsbund empfehlen, es ist nicht die Definition des Museums entscheidend, sondern es ist entscheidend, dass man sich tatsächlich Regeln gibt, die ethisch international verankert sind und auf die ein Konsens besteht. Dann kann man auch über die Internationalität intervenieren, wenn es national Entwicklungen gibt, die den Prinzipien entgegenstehen. Also das wären meine 3 Sätze dazu. Das heißt natürlich nicht, dass ich jetzt sage, wem gehört das Museum, sondern deutlich mache, dass das ist nicht die entscheidende Frage, wem das Museum gehört, sondern wie das Museum, wie die Gedenkstätten verfasst sind, ob sie einen pluralen, demokratischen Diskurs garantieren und einen internationalen Austausch.
Thank you very much. Gwendolyn, would you manage to put it into 3 sentences?
I could probably put it into 1. I think first and foremost, I think museums belong to the people. I see myself as a steward. I mean, it's easy for me as being at the Smithsonian because it is part of the government. The people fund the government. This is our institution. But I think from a larger level, I'd like to get back to that word about facilitators, that we belong to our communities and the people we serve.
Thank you very much. Anna Vetsi, Poma.
Yeah, I think museums belong to the people. I totally agree with that. And as for schools, it's supposed to represent the whole society, but as the schools are supposed to be a place where people go and learn something, and it's supposed to be an institution that enables the people to be all equal in the society, or to find their place into the society according to who they are. The school is also a means to reproduce social injustice into the society. And I think the museum now, today, a work needs to be done so to enable those museums to represent the society in general in its diversity, and in this way works need to be done.
Thank you. Last but not least,
I agree with my all previous speakers, and I would add that the museums constitute a part of a national heritage, and so in a broader sense they belong to the whole society, and because of that they shall be autonomous in their scientific and educational activities, as for instance are the universities, and they also should respect political and social pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel that we rather sort of not closed or ended or answered the question, but we rather opened a big fuss with all possible sorts of questions. And I hope that, so what you can do, there will be a chat on the conference platform, and people can still ask questions and put up comments. And if you had some time to go onto this platform and go onto our session and maybe answer some of those questions, the speakers and engage into further discussions, this would be great, but I think everybody would think at home. Thank you very much to you all. Thank you very much, Gwendolyn Rees, because I know it's very early in the morning in Washington, DC. So I thank you very much that you still agreed to participate in the discussion. Also Professor Mosh, who joined us from his holidays, and to Betsy Poma and to Piotr Majewski, and also to our translators, Sabine Hübler and Elisabeth Frank-Gross-Ebner, who I didn't listen, but I understand I'm sure they did very good work. And also to our technical moderators, Mateusz Mazzini and Maria Kobielska. And thank you very much for the session. I will still contact you via email, and now I'll be very, very rude, and I will just close the session because the next session starts in a minute and I have to join it. Otherwise I will be very rude to the others. But thank you very, 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 very much. And I'm very happy and glad that we managed to organize this session and hope for further contacts. And I will write you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zosia. Thank you for very professional moderation.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.